I'm Mark Seifter.
And I'm Linda Zayas Palmer.
And this is Arcane Mark.
Hello, everybody.
And welcome to GM Tools Onboarding New Players, the episode that's all about how to bring new players into the game. And a game which could be a lot of tabletop RPGs, but may also include some specific tips to Pathfinder 2nd Edition. Let's be real, it will include specific tips to Pathfinder 2nd Edition at some point throughout the process, and generally the Pathfinder family of games. So,
well, Whiskey, I do declare.
Linda, you do declare. Oh, me.
Southern Belle.
Yes. So, let's start talking about onboarding new players. So, why would you want to onboard new players? You probably already know this if you're watching this episode. Onboarding new players is pretty much essential for most groups at some point in time to stay healthy, to bring in new ideas and new blood to the group and the hobby. Some groups manage to stay pretty stable with the same people for decades even, but a lot of groups have reasons that people switch out. A college group might have, if it's a mixed group of people of slightly different ages or that are doing different things on the degree track, it's going to have some people graduate before others, and that's sort of a typical way of splitting off. High school groups tend to potentially sort of taper off when people go to college, and all sorts of other reasons other than just school, like changing jobs and moving, or someone having a baby and not being able to play again for a while. There's a lot of reasons why your group composition will change.
People can move across the country, says Jim, hypothetically.
That's right. Well, that was included in changing jobs and changing locations.
Mm-hmm.
And Stump Monkey has been practicing his British accent for a long time.
You know, Stump Monkey, I'd say that when I hear your British accent, it really sounds authentic.
That's right. I don't think it's someone who's just sort of putting on a British accent for no reason during a stream. So the point is, eventually you're probably going to need to onboard new players, and it can be a real joy to onboard new players because they often have interesting ideas that are not necessarily sort of fallen into the rut of finding a good set of options and sticking with it consistently, which can mean that they come up with something that you never expected someone to do. Like a new player that I was showing Pathfinder 1st Edition, who read all of the material components that were in Pathfinder 1st Edition and asked to pull wool, used for illusions of pulling wool over people's eyes, out for spell component pouch into her ears when a heartbeat was singing. You can see all sorts of ideas like that just from new players a little more often than experienced players for whom everything is sort of it's in there enough that they know that you don't really have to care about those material components because they're in a pouch, and then they don't think, wait, I have a pouch that contains this thing, because it's not new and pressing and going through their mind at the time.
And experienced players, particularly in stable groups, tend to develop a box full of solutions that tend to work pretty well, that they're more likely to pull from, rather than jumping immediately into their more creative elements.
Like strategy and
yes.
tactical heuristics.
Yes, exactly.
That you could pull out to quickly probably solve the problem, but it's going to be in a pretty similar way to how you solve other problems for most players. New players are less likely to do that because they just don't have a heuristic built for how to solve a particular problem. It can mean that new players might not use as much strategy too. They might just go in swinging, just swing their weapon with basic attacks or other things like that. It's all sort of part of onboarding the player is to see uh, what the player's playstyle is and to make the player comfortable with all the different aspects of the games. And along the way, you might learn a thing or two as well from the new player.
I'd like to take a step back though, because we're starting to assume because this kind of assumes that the new player is already sitting at your table.
That's right.
So how do you get the new
That's
player?
not the first step.
But that's not the first step. The first step is how do you get new people to join your table? And I think that when you see someone who seems like they may be interested, so maybe you're playing your game in a game store or other public venue or a convention, and you see somebody who's wondering, a convention that's not one of the big ones that has a super organized system for getting people in, who seems like they may be interested in your table. Or maybe you're playing in like an open space in a dorm. That's where Mark and I found a lot of our folks. Or maybe you are...
we didn't have a huge number of people who just came to watch, seeing what we were doing in the dorm and then joined, but we did have some.
Yeah. So there's sort of that incidental, like, people are walking by and they're kind of lingering and they're seeming interested. So certainly it's worthwhile to pause what you're doing and engage with that person.
Right.
And see if they're interested.
Yeah, we should split up getting new players between these different venues. So
I'm assuming at this point you are the GM and you're running a game and you see that someone nearby is kind of watching and they might seem interested.
Right. So that's possibility one. And so in that situation, what would you do?
Well, in that situation, as the GM...
So you're running a game, and I'm sitting by, and I seem kind of interested. I'm looking at your miniatures that are moving around in your books and listening to the story that you're telling.
Yeah. So I'm not going to break off mid-sentence exactly in the middle of something, because that's going to make this person feel like they're intruding or interrupting in some way. So I'll look for a natural pause in the very near future. I'll look for a natural pause in the very near future to pause and acknowledge and engage with this person. And I'll introduce myself, and I'll ask them sort of if they've played the game that we're playing before. Because when I'm engaging new players, I like to have a general standard of seeing if they're familiar with exactly what we're doing, a broader category of what we're doing, or just like they don't know what we're doing. So
let's say I was watching your game, and eventually you found a stopping point.
Yeah.
And so, what would you say?
So it would be like, hi, I'm Linda. I'm running a Pathfinder game it's like, have you played Pathfinder before?
What's Pathfinder? Isn't that a car?
Oh my god, you're gonna be a troll mark on me today, aren't you?
I mean, most people haven't heard of Pathfinder.
Yeah.
What is this game anyway? Is this that thing that people were like worried about in the 80s?
I knew you were gonna reference the 80s. Like, seriously, Mark, your troll people are predictable.
Oh,
anyway,
okay. See, maybe they're not that trollish.
Anyway, that aside, I would say something. I'm a little.
Is this Dungeons and Dragons?
Well, Mark. Okay. Anyway. So that's actually a legit question. It's like, well, this game's very... you've heard of Dungeons and Dragons. This game's very similar to Dungeons and Dragons. It's a cooperative storytelling game that we're all playing here together, and you're certainly welcome to watch. And now it depends upon what we are. It depends upon from here what I'm running.
People are saying some of my questions are fairly reasonable.
The last one was fairly reasonable, yes. So that's one that you generally riff off of. So then at this point, it depends upon what I'm running, right? So am I running a home game, or am I running an official society game? If I'm running an official society game, then this would be a good time to give a little bit of a spiel about how this person can get involved, and let them know. And invite them to come and sit down and play with us on a future day. So, like, let's say that I'm running this. It's like, It's like, this is part of Pathfinder Society. We're playing, and then we play here at this store. We play here at this store every Saturday, starting at 10 a.m. You're certainly welcome to come join us, and I can give them some more information and a spiel based on sort of, this is going to be a little bit different for each person based on sort of what they seem to be interested in, and at this time, also, if I have players who I can tap to sort of talk to them a little bit more about it, if I have an experienced player at the table, because I don't want to completely stop the game for like a long time talking to them, but if I can delegate and designate a player to talk to them who is an experienced member of the community, to talk to them more about like how they can get involved in things like that, then that's gonna be a good
What if it
option
was
there.
a home group and not Pathfinder Society?
Well, if it's a home group, then
but you're in a public space with your home group.
If it's a home group, then there are sometimes ways to engage them even right from that very first session. It's less daunting for them for new people generally to watch rather than to be like, oh, do you want to play this NPC or whatever, like, unless they've literally like, oh yeah, I've played Pathfinder before, or I've played Dungeons and Dragons before and I'm familiar with this, and you have like a good thing to hand to them. Like, go get a chair and pull it up for them, and make sure that they introduce them to all the folks at their table introduce themselves, and you really make them feel welcome.
Another thing you can do if they do just watch the first session, either way, is if you're playing with a group of veterans that often play together and have established their own way of sort of communicating that they get things across, but everything's not very clear, as you might actually explain what's going on and how things are working.
So if the players like if the players have a strategy that they call like, oh yeah, we're just gonna do the usual thing, or it's like, oh yeah, we're gonna do the X strike special, or we're gonna do whatever, and they don't explain what we're doing. Or they
just fling off the names of a few
buff
spells.
Yes, it's like, oh yeah, so I've got haste, this. Because those kinds of technical terms can be really daunting to a new player. So you can kind of explain what's going on in generalities. You don't want to overwhelm a new player with explanations of absolutely everything that's going on.
And they could, people just might give a lot of very technical names of things. All right, hunt, prey, hunter shot, stride, and
so you could be like, oh yeah, he's playing a ranger. That means that he's really good at these sorts of things. So he's focusing his attacks on this particular person. And she's playing a barbarian. So you can get some. It really depends exactly on the person's level of experience with things. And I generally do step from like knowing this. Do they know the specific game? Do they know sort of the tabletop RPG genre? And if they don't know that, then I start engaging on sort of like board games and fantasy in general. And I like to have a sort of step process with that, because I find that having a process of figuring out where you can meet them where they are is important. And one thing that this really helps with for having a fixed process is reducing the likelihood of bias, reducing the likelihood that I'm going to look at someone and notice that they are a stocky middle-aged white man, and I'm going to look at someone and I'm going to notice that they are a younger woman, and I'm going to make sure that I'm not going to be making any sort of snap assumptions about who is more likely to be familiar with the game, because I'm going to be assuming that everybody is a blank slate.
is not familiar.
I'm going to be assuming that everybody is a blank slate, and that they're not necessarily familiar, and I'm going to jump in and I'm going to tailor then what I say based on exactly what I hear from them, because I recognize that like despite the fact that our community has become more inclusive over time, which is great and amazing, that there's still sort of there can still sometimes be these natural tendencies to assume that if somebody looks or acts more similar to sort of a stereotypical image of a gamer, that they be more likely to be familiar with things. And I want to make sure right from the get-go that I'm gonna nip any of that in the bud, and I think that this also helps signal to your players that to direct them away from making any assumptions of how familiar someone might be. Because frankly, like, even if I'm not going to assume that, that a potential female player is going to be less likely to be experienced with things, as a woman, like, I know that people assume that I'm less likely to know what I'm doing. I know that people are more likely to recommend actions and things that I do. Even when I say that I'm from Paizo, people will still, like, if I'm thinking through some options for a moment, recommend things for me in a way that I find unwelcome. Like, this still happens to me. So I know, and I remember it happening to me certainly before, more so. So I wanna set a message to that, and I'm also gonna watch that once we're playing too. How the dynamics is at the table, but that's more once you get started. But I think that establishing someone's baseline of experience and making sure that the players know that right up front can help to cut down on that situation somewhat.
That helps no matter what, and not just for someone who's watching.
Yes.
So before we go more into what to do afterwards, let's take some of the other possibilities for a new player right from the beginning.
Yes.
So first one is sort of like the lurker in a public space who seems to be interested in it. Number two possibility is someone who kind of knows that you're playing for whatever reason and asks or approaches you outside of the game. It's like, hey, I hear you play that Pathfinders. What's it about? Or just seems interested outside of game, like they might be interested in playing, even if they start tackling it sideline by what's it about.
Well, in this case, since you're not actively in the middle of running a game, you can give more information because you also don't have to worry about the fact that that person is less likely to feel like they're being an imposition. So you can give them more information without them potentially feeling uncomfortable or like they're being a burden. Because you want them to feel welcome, and part of that is making sure that they don't feel like they're bothering you. So you can give them more information. I'd say that, like, I'm very enthusiastic when I'm talking to new players, and that certainly helps. Making sure they know that you do want to play with them. So give them the information that they want. So you can start, like, I heard the Pathfinders. What's it about? So you can start by saying, oh, well, what have you heard about Pathfinder?
I think it's Dungeons and Dragons. They might have said.
Oh, well, they're both. It's like, oh, well, Pathfinder and Dungeons and Dragons are both tabletop RPGs. They're very similar games, in the way that people all gather together, sit around a table, tell a story together, stuff like that. Are you interested in getting involved in a game?
Is it like Monopoly?
Out of character, Mark. Well, it is a game that's all played around a table, but it's a cooperative game where everybody is all working together to tell a story.
Okay.
So
more like Gloomhaven?
Yes, exactly. More like Gloomhaven. Have you played Gloomhaven?
No, but I heard about it.
Yeah, well, Gloomhaven what have you heard about Gloomhaven? It's a game that's got
I heard it's really expensive, and it's got, like, these characters in it, and you fight against monsters.
Well, yes, it's Gloomhaven. It's sometimes it's hard to engage with Mark because Mark is making peak troll face at me in order to try to get me to laugh. But anyway, well. Pathfinder, yeah, exactly. So it's like, yeah, Pathfinder and Gloomhaven both have characters that you're going to be moving around on a map, and you're going to be fighting against monsters. But one big advantage that Pathfinder has over Gloomhaven when you're getting started is you don't have to buy, like, a big box to get started. There's a lot of ways to get started with Pathfinder without spending any money.
I heard you need an extra person that's like a dungeon master.
In Pathfinder, yes, you do. You have somebody who's the dungeon who has the game master. Usually, we call that. And they are presenting the story and the world and sort of the challenges that the characters face.
Is that the same thing as a judge or a storyteller?
Yeah, it's called judge and storyteller in a lot of other games. Have you played other tabletop games with a cooperative group sitting around a table?
Cooperative game. Well, I played Monopoly. It's not cooperative though.
Mark, how the hell has this person heard the terms judge and storyteller but unfamiliar with the idea? Anyway, I think people probably get the general idea. Trolling aside. But yeah, so the idea is presenting the general idea of a cooperative game and what sort of people are going to be getting into. That each person is taking the role of a character, and everybody is taking on the role of their own character.
Joe says they might be a LARPer.
Oh, that's a good point. But then why would they continually be comparing it to Monopoly? Anyway, Mark, your character is inconsistent. But the point is...
Rejected!
But the point is, yeah, so presenting the idea that each person's going to be taking on the role of a character, characters each have a variety of skills, some things that they're going to be better at and some things that they're going to be worse at. Players work together as a team to overcome obstacles, and in everything that the players try, if it's something of consequence, then there's going to be some chance of success and some chance of failure, and that chance is generally determined by rolling a 20-sided die, which we often call a d20, and then adding a number that represents how good that character is at that particular thing.
What if I want to have no chance of failure?
Well, the thing is that this is a storytelling game. So, if you watch a movie or a TV show and the characters had no chance of failure, it would get pretty boring, right?
But they do have no chance of failure in most TV shows. Think about it. A lot of the characters in those shows always succeed.
But they still run into obstacles. They succeed in the end, but they still run into obstacles along the way.
Yeah, but they succeed every time they run into those obstacles.
Not necessarily. You still see them running into setbacks, and when they run into those setbacks because something didn't go all according to plan, then that could be an example of something that might be represented in a tabletop game as a failed check. Like, let's say that the first thing the character tried to resolve the problem didn't work. Then that might be represented as a failed check.
Whenever he tries to punch them, they immediately kill. What if that's what I want to play?
Mark, your troll face. Alright, anyway. Well,
that question is not really particularly relevant just to the person who comes up to approach you, though. So
yes.
We should talk about player expectations for their characters and what system you're using and what they can do later in the episode.
Yeah, because this does get into what system you're playing, because
this person might want to play Pathfinder First Edition, for example.
This person may want to play Pathfinder First Edition. This person may want to play something like Mythender, where their characters are just like ridiculously
I don't know. Mythender is very Timmy, but you definitely
do
fail and lose in the world of Mythender. So I think that there's some things that this hypothetical, supposedly inconsistent person would like about it, and some things they wouldn't like. But they might like Pathfinder First Edition because it's very rocket taggy, playing against like default opponents.
Yeah. That
you could trounce, for example.
But this does bring up a good point to figure out what kind of game the person wants to play and what the expectations are. And if the person's expectations are way off what you're going to be able to deliver in your gaming group or your
let's
gaming
say they actually really thought it was Monopoly, so they wind up wanting to play like something like Racketeer or one of those other games where their character sets up an item shop and just stays in the item shop the whole time.
Yeah.
And whenever someone else comes to the item shop, they're like, I have a hotel next to my item shop, pay more rent.
Because what the goal of recruiting new players is not to like force everyone you possibly find who remotely shows any interest in the game into playing the game.
One of us. One of us.
It's to a wide spectrum of players can enjoy Pathfinder and other tabletop games, but if what the player is looking for is incompatible with what you're offering, recommending other games that they may want to try is often a much better fit rather than trying to find someone who's like, I want to win in one shot, I want to play One Punch Man, and you're playing a game that isn't going to fit with that. Like, it's not worth the person's time and energy and effort, nor is it worth the disruption to the people at your table to try to shoehorn in someone when you know that that's not what they're looking for.
All right, so we talked about someone who is sort of lurking and looking and seems to be interested, someone who comes up to you. Now let's talk about another situation for the initial approach, which is your group is low on players, or even they're not, but you just come across someone that is already your friend, or that you, or maybe acquaintance, or that you know that you're like, this person probably would enjoy playing a tabletop role-playing game. But they did not approach you. So how would you do that?
I would say that that's a great opportunity to bring the game up in conversation and talk to them about it, and see if they seem interested. If they're your friend or acquaintance, figuring out what kinds of games they like to play in general, opening up a general conversation about games based on what you know of what they like to play. Because, I mean, like, you probably, if you're a gamer and your friend is a gamer, like, you probably have some sense of what kinds of games they like to play already.
What if they're not, but they just seem like they're really into the fantasy genre in general? Like, maybe it's a coworker who is always talking about, like, several different fantasy TV shows that they watch and are really into them, but are actually not a gamer.
So because again, like, when it's somebody who's already like established friend or coworker, just being like, have you tried the Pathfinder? Like, without any sort of in is like really super awkward. So using fantasy shows or games or other, being like, hey, I play this game that I think you might be interested in, and then talking to them about it.
So let's do one like that, because that's actually one that's potentially a little harder. Where I will be not trollish, but I will be, or at least relatively not trollish. I will be a person who does not know about Pathfinder, that it even exists, and very, very little on tabletop role playing games, but is really into like fantasy TV shows like Game of Thrones, and that that. That they're really into those. So what would you do and say for that? Because I think that you gave a good tactical technique, but then an example will help.
Yeah. And I also recognize that my improv brain is unfortunately a little bit slow right now, as you've probably been able to tell. So So first of all, I would say recognize a time when you are not like super tired and out of it, and are going to be able to present it in a good way. So like, don't pick a time when you're super tired and out of it like this. But I would say that presenting it to them. So I think I'm going to do this more an out of character style rather than purely in character style here. So I guess what I would say is so you know that they're really into that show. And if you watch that show too, then you'll.
What if you didn't watch that show?
If you didn't watch that show,
I picked Game of Thrones on purpose
because I don't watch that show. Okay, well,
I don't watch it either.
And you don't watch it
but
either.
I've
so
read some of the books, so I can pretend that I'm someone who knows at least the beginning of the show if we were doing a mini improv. But in particular, it's someone is into the genre, but does not overlap with you and does not play tabletop RPGs and probably doesn't know much about them, but you think that they would really like it.
So I think that if you have I think that it also depends upon how well you know this person. Like, are they somebody that you would want to, say, invite to get lunch with you and your gaming group, so that you guys could introduce them to some new folks, and then have it kind of come off over the course of the conversation, rather than have it be like a big thing? Or are they someone who you don't necessarily feel comfortable doing that with?
I mean, that's another tip that you didn't give before when you were saying that you could talk to them about things.
Yeah,
so.
like, because I'd say that it's more comfortable when it's not just like let's just present this entire blob of information. Because I have a thing about, like, tips about consolidating the information about new games while not overwhelming potential initiates. There's a few facts that I often give, which I gave in my sort of thing there, which is that it's a cooperative storytelling game where people take on the role, where different people take on each player. All one of the players take on the role of a single character who is generally a member of a heroic group that's trying to overcome opposition. And then there's one player called the Game Master who is presenting the monsters, the other characters who are in the world. If this person's familiar with RPGs in general, I'd use the term NPC for those instead of just saying the other characters who are in the world. It's presenting the challenges, the story, and but unlike the author of a book where the author knows exactly where everything's going to go, one of the great things is that each of the main characters is being controlled by another player, by one of the players, and so you don't know sort of what kind of hijinks. Nobody really knows exactly where things are going to go because it's a storytelling experience that everyone is pulling in together. So I usually give some paraphrase of that particular thing.
What would you say about the balance between talking to somebody just one-on-one who's not into the hobby and talking to them with your entire gaming group who are all know each other and are all in a group with the exact hobby, depending on the person? Because you gave both of those as potential strategies.
Well, it depends upon that person, right? Are they somebody who's looking for, who's like, let's say that you're early in college, or like it's somebody new to the company who's looking, that has just joined your company, or somebody who would be comfortable with a larger group who's looking for more friends and wants to reach out? Or are they somebody who would find that sort of experience overwhelming and might feel alienated or isolated because they don't have that one shared connection and they're being brought into the group? I mean, that's one of the things that makes this a little bit tricky, right? We can give some broad categories, but it really depends upon knowing the person, which of these is going to be best for them.
Absolutely. And that's sort of what I was getting at too, which is that the group strategy can be a good one, but it might be the wrong way to talk to someone.
Or it can be a larger group that includes, a larger group that includes you and maybe one or two people from your gaming group, so that you're not the one who's explaining everything.
Right.
Because the thing is too that it helps the new person to have different perspectives on what the game is about. And part of the thing that I was starting to get at with like going out to lunch or doing something else is that you can have something where like the game is a topic of conversation, but it's not the only topic. It also depends on knowing your gaming group too, right? Like if you know that your group is going to get together and they're only going to be talking about like memes from your game in a way that's going to make that person feel alienated, then you shouldn't do that.
And there are some questions about going through the all of the different Paizo specific games, and with a new player you don't necessarily need to go through all of the Paizo specific games. If this is someone that you're trying to you think would be interested in one game in particular, tailor your pitch to the new player based on the one you think that they would like the most.
Yeah, and I mean, general definitely is better than specific here. You don't need to be like, well, in Starfinder, you're going to have if you want to have a full attack, then you're going to be making two attacks. You're going to be making two attacks at a -4 penalty, or whatever.
Or -6.
Or -6.
With the 3 attacks if you're a certain character at the right level.
If you're a certain character at the right level. Whereas if you're playing Pathfinder First Edition, then your first attack has no penalty unless you're using 2-weapon fighting or multi-attack or one of those other type things, a rapid shot. But then if you're making your second attack, then it has a base of -5, which is similar to in Pathfinder Second Edition.
Explaining Linda. I think you don't even need to even mention the other games. Like if you think this Game of Thrones person in your social group would want to play Pathfinder Second Edition in your game of intrigue, you don't have to be like so. I know you like Game of Thrones. I thought you might be interested in this tabletop role player game we're playing. It's a cooperative storytelling game in Pathfinder. You don't have to be like, but by the way, there's also Starfinder, which is in
Yeah.
outer space, and then name a whole bunch of other different games. You could just sort of be focused on the one that you think that they want to play, because otherwise you're going to overwhelm them.
Yeah.
And a lot of people's response to being overwhelmed with too much information or just a lot of irrelevance, like, this is too much. This isn't for me.
Either I don't want to do this, or I don't like this, or I'm not smart enough for this, or things like that.
Yep.
But I would say if you are introducing several games, it would be like, let's say you were trying to gauge if you're doing organized play and you're trying to gauge if someone might be more interested in Pathfinder or Starfinder. It's like, oh, this is a game that's set in more of sort of a classic fantasy world. There's also a game called Starfinder that's set kind of in more of a futuristic spacey thing, more of a futuristic spacey setting, and it's a really similar rules, but it's what kinds of settings interest you more. Do you tend to be more interested in fantasy or sort of science fiction sort of stuff? So getting at it from that more top level rather than digging into the specific mechanical differences, or like, this one is if you're more interested, so like the more like aliens and space exploration and space battles versus traditional sword and sorcery fantasy.
Needless to say, in many cases, in any of these situations, if you do try one of these approaches and they turn you down, then alright, they turned you down.
Yeah.
There's some instances, and definitely have happened to us before, where someone will turn you down, but then they're like, say they're the lurker, and they're lurking in a lot of sessions over and over again, and there's a way to eventually bring them in. Or if you're talking about someone who's already close to you, who you're trying to get into games because of their other hobbies, who turn you down multiple times. One that has not happened to us, but that stereotypical one is like a spouse who's very into fantasy and other things, but just doesn't want to join the gaming group just yet. Who you might have added incentive to try again to see if there's any way, because of the fact that it can be really fun to game with your spouse.
Yeah. And it also depends upon like why they said they weren't interested. If it's like, oh, I don't have time for that, then so if somebody wasn't interested because they didn't have time, then that's someone who you might eventually ask again later. If you have a reason to think that the circumstances have changed, but don't like nag them about it. But if someone's like,
no, that's where those games that made people like kill each other down in those tunnels, and I would never be a part of that, or else it would jeopardize my morality or something like that. Then you probably don't want to ever ask them again.
Although funnily enough, I have empirical evidence that somebody there do exist people out there who are afraid of the name Dungeons and Dragons because of what they heard, but when
they're fine with Pathfinder, that's different.
Yeah, I actually had a therapist once who really didn't work out, who had ascribed to that sort of satanic panic type thing, and I explained Pathfinder in an indirect way, and he thought it sounded great. So that was funny. Yep. But that's
actually apparently pretty common.
Yeah. But that's still not someone that I would really want to recruit if somebody has that sort of preconceived notion.
Absolutely.
But it is funny.
So let's move on from the initial approach, because we almost did like a mini short length episode that was 90% on the initial approach to a new player.
Yeah.
But there's a few other steps that are really, really important for onboarding the new player. So whatever of the three ways, and there are other ways than that, or variants or combinations of them, are how the new player approached you or you approach them. You now have a new player. And they sure have agreed to play.
All right.
They may, there are two possibilities. They either showed up to the first session, possibly because maybe they were a lurker who you were able to pull in. Like, let's say PFS or home group. For PFS, they like saw you setting up and started talking to you, and then you had a spot open, perhaps. Or for whatever reason they just showed up. in another circumstance, you have some time and you can try to get them to do what you want, but they may or may not listen to you before the first session.
All right. So I think that step one is figuring out how is their character getting built. Do they have the resources that they need and providing those resources?
So let's start with the easier one, which I did actually say second, which is they've agreed to play and they seem like they might actually be willing to listen to you if you ask them to do something before the first session.
Mm-hmm.
But how would you recommend getting that done?
If it's organized play, they have to have they have to either have a character or play a pre-gen, right? So,
sure. But what about the situation where like you've recruited them or they've asked you about it and there's time?
Yeah.
Before the first session.
So I'd say if for organized play, providing them with resources, for how to build their character. I would generally recommend if there's somebody who hasn't really built characters before, there's somebody who's new to the system, working off of sort of the core rulebook only model, or recommending that they start with a pre-gen, for building that character. So sort of meet them where they're at and see how, because just throwing a core rulebook in front of someone and being like, build a character, especially like good God, don't be like, oh yeah, you can build things from anything, here's the link to the additional resources page, make sure that you have the books and that you can bring the documentation. No.
In fact, I would recommend setting up a one-on-one with the player
to work on
where
the character.
Like they make all of the choices, but you guide them through making their character with them. So you just tell them, you do all the things that, honestly, the Pathfinder 2nd Edition core rulebook does show you which one to do, but don't even make them read that process that's in the introduction with the character sheet in the 1 through 10. You just tell them, all right, next we're going to pick your ancestry, and you can flip them to the pages and show them the different pictures and have them read the, you might want to play an elf if, and here's what your character might do and other people might think and things like that.
Yeah, and this also depends upon their experience, right? Like if you have a player who's played a game like 3.5 Dungeons and Dragons or Pathfinder First Edition or other like later editions of Dungeons and Dragons, they clearly like just want to get in and do it themselves. Like don't give the person more information than they want.
And I guess the episode is called Onboarding New Players. And it could have been meant, like, getting someone who's new to your group who played Pathfinder already, but I think we both sort of mostly meant onboarding someone who's not played.
I'm assuming that they haven't played the game that you're playing right now. But it is true that people who've played other tabletops may want to read it themselves.
Yes. And they might be completely ready to build it because it's similar enough. Especially if they played Pathfinder First Edition and you're doing Pathfinder Second Edition.
Yeah, so figuring out sort of where they're at, but having a sort of guided character building and making sure that they know up front that having a guided character building, offering the option of playing a pre-gen that fits more their general thing. Like if it seems based on talking to them and going through things that they want to play a rogue, having them play a pre-generated rogue. And see what they think of that, and being sure that they know that they're going to have options to rebuild and replace things with their character if they're things that they don't like. So, in organized play, that's already built in with the first level rebuild. But like, if you've got a new player and they play their character and they don't like it, like, give them the ability to fully rebuild their character or to rechange options even in the middle of the session if they want to come in with a completely new character the next time. And make that process even more streamlined than it would normally be in your game so that they have a chance to try things out.
And Kitsune Warlock says, characterization in 2nd edition Pathfinder is so streamlined that they had players who never played tabletop RPGs before build a character in 20 minutes who MVP the first game. So
awesome.
But even so, if it's a brand new player, like, giving a little hand-holding of just showing them where to make the next choice, but let them make all the choices can just make people feel like they're a little less overwhelmed than the entire core rulebook. It's a matter
of like, as with everything that's providing information to new players, communication is paramount to see how much to draw that line between providing wanted assistance and seeming to be patronizing or condescending or anything else like that.
So
and making sure that they're able to make their own choices, and I think that you sort of gauge that based on what their responses are. If you get a lot of like, oh, I don't know, or that kind of stuff, then that seems like someone who who might want to be guided more. Zathos' 2-week character creation YouTube video is quite helpful before PCO for your new players. Awesome.
So, now let's talk about they just showed up to the session after you recruited them, or maybe right as you recruited them. So obviously, if it's org play and they just showed up to the session,
pre-gen,
and they do not have a character, you give them a pre-gen.
Yes.
So let's assume it is a home game or org play, and they showed up with a character of dubious provenance.
Yes.
Because you know that they have never played before, and that they made this themselves. Like, maybe it is completely made, right? Especially since Pathfinder 2nd Edition makes it a lot easier. Maybe it's not all filled out yet. You're not really sure.
Well, I would say that if I don't know, for a lot of times you're not going to know for a fact that how new someone is if they just show up to your table. So I would say that I like to give folks the benefit of the doubt that they built their character correctly until the first time that I see evidence that they didn't.
So you wouldn't check the new player's sheet just to see if they accidentally.
If I knew for a fact they were a new player.
We're talking about someone you just onboarded as a new player.
So I just onboarded them as a new player.
They may have played a lot of other tabletop RPGs.
I didn't have a chance to so I think yes. In that case, I would want to. I would probably want to see their sheet just briefly to give a very quick glance to make sure that things looked okay.
A lot of people deny themselves something that they just missed. Here's a classic new player one for if you're rushing through that intro is missing those 4 boosts at the end ability boosts at the end of generation, and having a character who's doesn't have those 4 boosts. That's gonna make you a lot weaker. Because you only have 5 total boosts instead of 9 total boosts on your character. Even though, sure, they were all spread out. But still, like, I've seen people online who are like, this monk in my game is just really bad. And then someone's like, what are their stats? And they put the stats and they're like, whoa, they didn't do the 4 boosts. So,
also, I find that people can sometimes... Also, I can sometimes be a little more subtle about this, particularly if we don't have very much time. I'm going to try to sit next to that new player so that I can look at their character sheet during the session without having a big audit in the beginning, and notice if there's things that are going on, and notice if there's things that are going on that are off with that.
All right. So what if you either spy it with your sneaky Linda spying, or you intentionally audit it, and it is full of problems, most of which are some of the problems are against the character's favor because they just missed something that was going to boost their character, but some of which are very much in the character's favor as well. So like they missed those 4 ability boosts. They have like an ancient great worm dragon as their pet because they just saw a thing that said pet and they filled it in with ancient great worm dragon, and which is like 2 different kinds of dragons, and it didn't have a color, and so
I think this is going to depend both on how much time. Like, the last thing I want to do is like signal at the new player and be like, you built your character wrong. We're all going to stop the action to fix your character because you built your character wrong. Because even if you don't say those specific words, it could totally feel like that's a new player. So I guess the question is, do I have an experienced player at the table who I think can in a side conversation walk them through fixing their character because it's just a few things to fix during the session so that
what
they can
if you don't?
Pre-gen.
What if you do? What if you do, and you does not get to be the glib people on the stream saying, oh, there's somebody else who will do this, but you are the experienced player who is going to do that.
So you're not the GM anymore, you're the experienced player.
Yes, you're the person who's doing this for the group. It may even be the GM because the other players are doing something else right then.
Yeah, it could be if you can get the other players doing something else at the time.
Like the other players are like buying and selling gear.
So you're the experienced player. You're familiar with if you're the experienced familiar, you're familiar with the game. You look at the sheet and see how quickly you can figure out sort of what is going wrong here. so you're probably gonna have to, even though you're experienced, you're gonna want to pull out your core rulebook, and you're gonna want to walk through things because if you just quickly fix everything for the player and you're like, yeah, your bonus is too high here, it's too low here, and this feat's too high level, pick another first level feat. Here's the book. Like, you're not gonna show them where it is that they went wrong and walk through things. So walk back through the process with them. I would say is ideal, and figure out where their confusion lies, so that you can answer those questions for them, and so they don't have that confusion in the future, and so that they feel empowered to make so when they're making new characters, that they're going to be able to make them correctly.
All right, so they've got their character, and it's a legal enough character that you don't really notice any problems.
And I would say, honestly, like, even if they're not a new player, players mess up against their favor quite a bit. As an experienced GM, if you have a sense of what the kinds of bonuses are that are appropriate, and you see the player's die roll, and then the net result they give you just seems like aberrantly low, checking with them their bonus right then and there. It can be appropriate. Like, I know that we've had situations that come up even with very experienced players in our home group where we figure out that people haven't leveled up or given themselves all their bonuses because their bonuses just seem way too low on something. And then we caught someone who we've caught like a player who hadn't been able to show up in a while, that they had shorted themselves by 2 levels.
Yep.
They hadn't fully leveled up, even though we sent an email like, make sure you level up. It's like, oh yeah, I forgot to level up. So,
or where they had chosen like the big class feat for that level or something like that, but they had shorted themselves by 2 levels on like all their modifiers.
Yeah, and then if you have people mentioning Path Builder makes things easier to show and explain, absolutely. The biggest rule of thumb is to be kind when fixing things. Exactly. Never assume that people made mistakes never assume that errors on character sheets came because somebody wanted to cheat.
Mm-hmm. Even if it is really in their favor.
Yes, exactly.
People just mess up. That's how it happens.
Yeah. So going through and helping them work out like what those corrections are going to be. And I think that it's important to acknowledge that, and I mentioned this too with like even super experienced players, even people who've been playing Pathfinder for like 6-7 years are going to make mistakes. When I go back through and look at my characters, like for my Pathfinder Society characters, there's a decent chance there's going to be a mistake in there somewhere. Everybody makes mistakes in character building, and so I think just acknowledging that and being upfront with that, like it is more welcoming than being like, oh yes, you have made this mistake.
Ha 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 ha! You have made this mistake.
New player, how dare you? No, like, hey, it's
everyone
really easy to
point and laugh at your humiliation.
It's like, hey, it's completely natural that's an easy thing to miss. Let's go through and make sure that your character's got all the strength that they're supposed to have.
Okay, though.
Yeah.
They have a character that it seems legal enough that your Linda spying is not sufficient to spot anything without actually doing a full audit, or you did an audit and if there's anything else you missed it during the time that you did the audit. But now you're ready to play your first session with this new player you're onboarding, which is still sort of a trial run, both for the new player with the game system and with your group dynamic with the new player. So, what are your top tips for that first session with the new player? Do you treat them exactly the same as everybody else in that first session so they know that they're not being singled out? Or are there particular ways that you're going to show the new player the ropes without making it seem like you're patronizing them?
Yes, definitely. So I would say this is very much where the amount of experience they have is gonna come into play with how I'm going to approach it.
And also their personality.
Yes.
I've met new players who have no experience with basically anything, but are sort of the type that are like, well, I can figure it out right away.
Yes.
And that you need to treat them differently. That even someone who, they've actually played Pathfinder 1st Edition, but when they come into a new game, they're like, oh gosh, this is pretty different. I bet the whole strategy is different. I don't know which end is up, and it's going to take me a while to get used to it. I could use some advice. Now, if they actually tell you that, then that makes it a little
easier.
If
a new player actually tells you I could use some advice and explains in plain language how much guidance they want, then you found a unicorn, honestly.
Yes. Because
you're usually gonna have to find that out.
That's
yourself.
true in GMing. It's true in game design that people know when they are not having fun,
Mm-hmm.
and they typically know when they are having fun.
Mm-hmm.
These are things that you could know.
Yes.
But when it comes to knowing people knowing how much guidance they need when, or
Mm-hmm.
knowing what's causing them to not have fun, or what the issue
Mm-hmm.
is, that's hard. Like legitimately, that's hard if for an industry professional. So
and it's hard as a GM too.
it's very
you've got
hard
a
for the
whole table,
player
particularly
to
if you've got
tell you that.
particularly if you've got a mixed group of new players. And if you've got a mixed group of new players who are at different levels of like how much guidance they want,
Oh boy.
then that is a challenge in and of itself. I would say that if you've got that mixed group, starting them all off at the same point, which is going to be more guidance than some want and less guidance than others want, and then gravitating based on how they respond is good, because by starting them off at the same point, you show that you're treating them equally and then meeting them where they are, as opposed to making assumptions.
Right. So, I guess we didn't talk that much about the situation where the entire group is new except you, or large swaths of the group is new. We talked about like one new player at a time.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to go back and necessarily go deeply into that, except for to say what you said there, Linda, which is you need to calculate based on the full group. But so let's go back to our usual situation of so you've got this new player, and they're playing through their first session, and with the caveat that you need to figure out exactly where they're at compared to other new players.
Yeah.
What general advice can you give?
Well, Samurai says you can ask them away from the group how they would like to approach it. I would say that can definitely help if you have a rapport with this person already and they're your friend.
And also if they're introspective and
also
have
if
a
they're
good
introspective
idea.
and know that, because a lot of players aren't going to know if you ask like, hey, because then if you're asking like, hey, do you want me to when your turn comes up, do you want me to provide some specific examples of things that you might be able to do, or do you feel like you want to go because usually people I would say that the average person isn't necessarily going to know how much assistance they want.
Right. They won't know until they start getting annoyed with too much assistance or lost
by too
with too little assistance.
Exactly. And I would say that asking them if you know that they're an introspective person, you have that sort of rapport with them.
It's kind of like if you're sitting around in your house and it's not like really hot and it's not really cold and you're not uncomfortable, you're probably not thinking it at that particular time. It's like, gosh, it's room temperature right now.
Yeah.
Similarly, your player's probably not going to know until they start getting annoyed or lost how much they need.
Also, I may be concerned that asking someone to inform you when they need guidance and how is putting another mental burden on them.
And also, if they're nervous and they don't want to be a burden, they might be like, oh, yeah, no, I don't need guidance, and they really needed it.
They needed it and they won't tell you.
They didn't want to impose on you.
Yeah, exactly. So I probably default more if I don't know the person to just waiting until I'm at the table and watching how they're responding. So
you would say entirely reactively is how you handle the first session with a new player.
I personally have a lot of experience as a GM and a fairly high score in sense motive. So
you're also very empathic.
Yeah, and I'm very empathic. So personally, for me, a purely reactive approach works best. But I do think that a proactive approach can work better for other people.
Okay. So, can you recommend a proactive approach for our viewers in general who are like, well, I don't have Linda's ability to read the room and read people's emotions quite as easily. I'm more comfortable with a script of a default and then adjusting if it turns out to be not great. What would you recommend for that default, or is the answer just like try something?
I would say start by approaching them. Make sure that the first engagement that they have in character is low stakes. So that you have NPCs engaging them very early on. So like during the mission briefing of a scenario, or in other cases, start the session with character introductions, and see how they introduce their character. If they introduce their character, they're like, my character's an elf. and she's a ranger, and I have a badger, and the badger's name is Bitey, and that's what he says. Like, then you know that this player may be more, may need a little more assistance because of how they presented things. And if someone comes and it's like, ah, yes, I am the troubadour, fanciful the great, the gnome who always walks around with giant clown pants, or something, then basically you can sort of gauge their comfort level somewhat in how loudly and confidently they present their character in the beginning,
Though
as well
that could be a mistake if you're talking about giving them tips on rules parts of the game, because that person who is unconfidently role playing might know every combat rule and have read them all up, and the person who is fanciful pantaloons may not be able to understand any of the actual rules of the game.
That's a good point. I'm getting into that.
They might be good at role playing.
So I'm getting into that sort of like for the that's sort of the start of the introduction, and then in the actual character, and then having sort of like the banter and role play. That can give somewhat of a sense of how comfortable they might feel with some of the role playing aspects of the game as those come up, and how to introduce them to role playing scenes, and how put on the spot versus comfortable they may feel in those situations. So I'd say that if there's a player that presents their character more dynamically, like that, like player number 2, then that can be a great person to have be the first one that the NPCs ask the question. Whereas if there's a player who's a little bit more reserved and withdrawn, giving them the chance to listen in character to how several other people answer first before a question comes to them. Asking lower stakes, less confrontational, lower impact questions where that are more tailored toward their characters.
Like maybe what drink they want at the tavern if everyone meets at the tavern,
exactly. rather than like what are you doing here?
Or even just like you all met at a tavern. Suddenly there's a giant tavern brawl and fireballs are shooting everywhere. How are you going to survive this?
Yeah, exactly.
As your first question.
So I'd say you sort of gauge that for that. That's what I use for the social gauge. For our role playing encounters to start with. And it's also important, particularly with that, to gauge throughout the session, because I've had plenty of players who are hesitant in the beginning of the session and are dynamic and expressive by the end. So don't assume that they're going to stay the same. Watch how they react.
That's due to your.
Yeah, I know.
That's due to your application of the techniques.
I know. Yeah, that's true. Fair enough. But I'd say that like looking for how long people pause, whether they're making eye contact or staring at their sheet, things like that. But I would say too, like for the combats and things like that. Let's say that you've gotten into your first combat. If you have control over what the encounters are, making that first combat encounter with the new player be an easier combat is good to make the stakes lower. Regardless of whether you do or not targeting the new player with super deadly, dangerous, and complicated effects to start with. So like if you have a monster that has something like this poison that's going to entangle you and all these other things, like hit somebody else with that, and like first hit them with a more basic attack.
If the player's like, I'm an elf sorceress and this is my talking cat, like maybe don't throw the cat into a vat of acid.
Yeah, exactly.
It kills the cat in the first combat to show how gritty things are without killing a PC.
Yeah, no, don't go after their pets. Like, just don't go after the pet of a new player. Just don't do it.
Kitsune Warlock says, leave the body horror monster for the second or third encounter.
Yes, indeed. Don't throw that in right away. And let them, and then give them warning that their turn's coming up. I mean, it's good practice anyway to make sure that people know that they're on deck when it's somebody's turn, either that you have the initiative order all written up for everybody or that you're warning people when they're going to be next, so they have more time to think about things. And then, so if the player then doesn't immediately jump in and be like, okay, I'm going to attack this one, then you can sort of prompt them through things. So it's like, all right, Sione, who do you want to attack?
Sione's like, I'm talking to my lizard dragon.
It's like your lizard dragon is looking nervously at these enemies.
I say, stop bothering my lizard to them.
All right, who are you going to target that challenge at? Are you targeting that challenge more at the big muscular orc who looks like she's leading the warband, or are you targeting that challenge more at some of those weaker followers that look like they'd be easier to pick off with your magic?
Who's bothering the lizard more?
Well, if okay, so it's like, it looks like the one over on the side who's got some cuts into his body from when Valorous hit him before is looking over at the lizard and thinks that the lizard might be easy pickings.
Stop bothering the lizard, cut guy, I say.
Well, do you want to use any of your magic spells to show that person what happens if they want to mess with your lizard?
Can't I just use my charisma to stop them from bothering the lizard?
Well, you're in a fight right now. They're not looking like they're very much in the mood for a conversation.
But I'm gonna say it in a way that's threatening.
All right then. So you can try to threaten them and see if you can catch them off guard. So in this point, then I would prompt them based on the mechanics of the game.
Demoralize.
I prompt to demoralize at this point, for example.
Also, bothering the lizard wound up sounding like a euphemism by the end of that.
Stop bothering the lizard, Mark.
You stop bothering the lizard, Linda.
Anyway, so that could be an example of like if they want to.
Can I also cast a spell? I want to cast Fireball.
Yes, you can. Fireball's 2 actions, right?
Yes.
Okay, that's what I thought. Yes, you can. You can do both.
Alright, I center a Fireball on that guy who has wounds that Valoros is stabbing.
Well, and then it would be like, if you do that, then Valoros is going to get hit by the Fireball too, and he's going to have to try to jump out of the way.
He's good at dodging.
Is that okay with you, Valoros? And then if Valorous' player is cool with that.
What if Valorous' player is not cool with that?
Then I would explain
but the new player wants to do a Fireball.
I would explain to the new player that generally when your character is going to be hitting other characters in the crossfire, we need to make sure that they're okay with that, and give a different fireball centering that didn't hit.
What if it was
Valoros.
a fairly small room and there was nowhere to center it that wouldn't hit Valoros because like the back of the room was 10 feet from there?
I would say like, all right, so
but would
if we
hit
want
all
this
the
work out,
enemies and also Valoros.
Yeah, well then this gets into some more specifics of what happens if a player proposes PvP in general.
I'm just saying particularly if it's a new player. And they're really excited about they were made their lizard dragon angry, and now they're gonna do like a dragon breath fireball to after they intimidate.
I mean, if Valorous' player isn't okay with that, then I think that suggesting that Valorous' player Valorous back out on their turn and like having the sorcerer delay for Valorous to get out.
So if the sorcerer player had already done the demoralize, but could have done that strategy, would you try to retcon the demoralize and be like, you know what, we'll do your demoralize later?
We'll do the demoralize later. You've already rolled. We already know it's going to succeed.
But we can have Valorous back off.
We can wait for Valorous to back off first so that you can
also,
hit all
incidentally, even though I just sort of had this person just talk to their lizard, the turn of demoralizing first, the target that you want to fail the fireball the most, is something that not that many people, compared to how many probably should consider doing it, do. But that debuff to the reflex save is really going to help.
And also in this case, because they were not really sure who they wanted to attack, I chose the one that the team would probably tactically like the most and be most likely like, oh yeah, you took that one out. The injured one. So... But yeah, exactly. So even if they really aren't sure, you can try to guide more toward that.
Give them a little bit of a retcon, if necessary.
You can give them a little bit of retcon if necessary.
If you were a hardliner, it'd be like, well, you demoralized, so you can't do that. You can't wait for Valeros.
No, but saying like, we'll wait on that. We already know. We're already going to know that you succeeded.
So how far does it go towards sort of being gentler to the new player? Let's have another hypothetical, which is that that for some reason that really injured orc gets to go and gets to go because of the delay for Valeros, and somehow can't attack Valeros. Maybe Valeros has a sanctuary on it, or for whatever reason, while the sorcerer was waiting, the orc had to go and attack the sorcerer and knock the sorcerer unconscious.
Well, why I would have the orc? First of all, if there's anyone else that's
there's
up on
no
the
one
field.
else.
It's literally just Valeros and the sorceress left.
And the sorceress, or it can spend 3 actions moving to another character.
Does it not have a ranged attack?
It has a thrown weapon that it could do at like a -6 penalty on someone else. It's got an axe it can throw, and then it doesn't have its melee weapon.
So the situation where, okay, so the combat has gone catastrophically bad for the group, such that only Valeros and the sorcerer are still left.
Or no, Ezrin and Harsk are back where they want to be, in range for Ray of Frost and their crossbow, and are doing great in the sense that they are more than 3 actions away from the orc, and the orc only has a throwing weapon. And Valeros has a sanctuary up. So I guess maybe Kyra is using Fire Ray back there with Harsk.
Okay, so I would say back up a bit, because in order to get to the situation where the sorcerer is out there and exposed more so than all the other characters.
But it's still like a move action away from there. And Valeros got a little beat. Maybe that's why he didn't want to be Fireball, but he's got a sanctuary up.
Then, yeah, I think...
And the Fireball would probably take out that orc, and the other orcs are actually... Other than the one who is mean to the dragon, the other orcs are too far away to make a good attack against Sony.
I would say that if it gets into that point, then I would prompt Sione. I would say, like, hey, it looks like things have actually gone pretty rough here. And I'm not going to hold the player to doing that action when that's like that enemy's eyeing you. I would let that player come out of that delay at that point.
So you would basically almost tell them that, this person looks like they're about to go
and attack you. Do you want to come out of delay? You can retreat back. You could retreat back to the others so that they don't lay into you with their attacks. Valeros is magically protected, so it looks like they're going to be coming after you now. So I wouldn't hold them to those other attacks. But if they do at any point during their turn do a demoralize, then it succeeds.
So the idea is to work with them to try to make sure that things work out in a reasonable way, without in this case without fudging or cheating, other than maybe telling them, if you delay that long, that that's the orc's turn from before, which is completely within the rules. Would you go so far as to actually cheat in the favor of the new player in order to make sure they didn't have a terrible first session experience?
No. I do not fudge rolls. I do what I sometimes consider fudge tactics, which is to Well,
you were even suggesting that there of attacking someone else and not Sione.
Exactly. I do fudge tactics. I do have opponents fight in ways that are not tactically sound to avoid attacking the new player. If I can think of any possible justification for it. This is where plenty of opponents might acquire a trait of hubris, or decide that they particularly have a thing they've spotted on one of these other characters that they don't like, and so they want to go after them.
The orc's mother was killed by caffeine overdose, and so Harsk's teapots have made the orc extremely angry because he's glorifying the use of caffeine, which killed the orc's mom, and so it's gonna charge down Harsk.
Yeah. So I don't fudge rolls, but I will fudge tactics.
Your tea killed my mother!
Mm-hmm.
That makes sense.
And
what happens if...
Or non-lethal attacks as well. I'll use those too. Like you know that first steps table where I wound up having the enemies use non-lethal damage and knock people out and take their armor.
Sure.
Instead of killing them.
Sure. So let's say you got the new player. Your sense, using your Linda readings, is that if they have a really horrible thing happen to their character, that they're probably just not gonna want to play.
Mm-hmm.
And the party steps on an AoE trap,
mm-hmm.
and they nat one. They've used their hero points, and they nat one the save against that trap, and it's a basic save.
Mm-hmm.
And you know that double the damage of the trap is actually going to be a one-hit kill. Because their character is an elf wizard with 8 con. Or even 10 con, some of those level 1 traps. And you rolled real high out on the table, although they don't know what the modifier is to the damage.
Mm-hmm. Is this an organized play scenario, or is this something that I've come up with myself?
What if it's an organized play scenario?
Okay.
What if it's 101? I think that has an AoE trap that I suggested nerfing the damage on, but it still could roll maximum, and someone could critically fail with a 10 con elf, and I believe that we calculated that that there is a very low possibility that that it could do an instant kill.
I would say that in this circumstance, the vast majority of GMs would fudge.
Okay.
I personally don't, but that's just part of my style and the social contract that I have with my players.
I guess that's how that's how I've always done it, and sort of all the people who played with me as the GM. I think a lot have picked up that.
I think that in that case, I would sort of talk to the new player about like, you know, how sometimes, you know, sometimes it does occasionally happen in the game, particularly when you're very low level, and, you know, see if give them a chance to cool off instead of bombarding with some things. And if I did lose someone for that, like, that sucks, but I do consider that the risk of character death is a part of the game. And, like, if there is no way through tactics, through warnings, through other things like that I could have prevented that particular case.
What if it's a home game?
If it's a home game?
It could have had any modifier to damage. You followed the rules. It had the right modifier to damage. Your 2d6 plus... your 2d6 plus 6 was 18, dealing 36 damage.
Yeah.
And the elf had 18 hit points.
If it's a home game, then providing some much easier than necessarily...
That's probably more than elf wizard has.
If it's a home game, then providing some easier than normal opportunity to bring that character back. Or perhaps a chance for them to bring in, like, some other very similar character that might be able to go along with them on a short quest so that they can retrieve something to bring that other character back, and then they can decide which of those two characters they want to play on an ongoing game. I'm still, like, the dice fall where the dice fall, and, like, personally, I think that that's an important part of the trust for me and my own ethos, and I know that's not everybody's, but that it's an important part of the trust with the players, that they know that where they fall, they're going to fall. I'm not going to fudge things against them. I'm not going to fudge things for them. The one thing that I have occasionally manipulated, which is a type of fudging that's not dice fudging, is I have occasionally manipulated hit points with custom built monsters that I've just built on the fly. If I realize that something is really off there. Personally, I do consider that to be a little different, because that's just something that's like, oh, I just threw that together. Oh no, wait, that didn't quite work.
Right. another thing, like in the Game Mastery Guide, deep backgrounds, there's like the idea of one of the parts of deep backgrounds is maybe one of the possibilities on all of the tables is maybe your character like died.
Mm-hmm.
So you could be like in a home game. So yeah, your character should have died from that.
Mm-hmm.
But what do you think about changing your background to be include this died aspect from deep backgrounds?
Yeah.
And like it might have some theological implications, and you see how in Resurrection it says when you come back from the boneyard you might have like a silver streak in your hair or some other thing.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that happened to you without Resurrection, and that might be something that the party's gonna have to figure out how to explain why exactly it happened here.
Yeah.
So you could just even come up with something like that, and be like, explain that they died by the rules,
Mm-hmm.
but that something weird is going on.
Also, if you want to put in you can put in an additional protective factor, like to your game as a whole. It's like, so in my Kingmaker game, for example, everybody had a one-time thing where the first time their character would die, their character instead receives some kind of grievous wound that wouldn't be removable by just basic healing, that imposes penalties. So that came with one character who then sustained a very severe shoulder injury that provided a strength penalty and prevented them from holding things in two hands.
Yeah, I think his strength was okay, but he took a -1 penalty anytime he had to use that arm
hand for stuff.
For
That's
strength
what it
or
was.
dexterity based
right.
stuff. So two-handed weapons, we're gonna take that anytime he had to use that arm.
Yeah.
So he wound up being the only person who ever died in that Kingmaker game, but he sure did die pretty harshly because summoners be dangerous.
Yeah, and then then I had an event later on. Well, it would only be removable by regeneration, but I didn't make them wait until the level where they would have regeneration. There was like an event that they had where they found this mystical tree, and it imparted some kind of boon upon each character, and for that character it was the removal of that wound.
Mm-hmm.
So you can in a home game you have more latitude to come up with things.
That's right.
And in organized play, yes, there's an excellent point. The welcome boons are a great way to help prevent death of new characters, and that is exactly why they were created, to help
That's
people in
what
that
they're
situation.
for.
Thanks for bringing that up, Trippy.
It's a legal way to do that, and it's not fudging because it's a welcome boon. All right, so I think we've started from the pitch, and we've gone down through getting them to the first session, and getting them through the first session. So, what do you suggest to do after the first session is done? Would you say that people should do anything differently with their new player after that first session?
Do you mean at the conclusion of the first session, or in session 2 with a new player?
I mean, at the conclusion of the first session, and in between the first session and potentially the second session.
I would say at the conclusion of the first session, taking some time to check in with them on how things went, and make sure that they know about when the next session is, and that they have some way to contact you to talk about anything from that session, and if there's any follow-up you want to do. So, like, if there's something with their character that you want to follow up on, and it's like, hey, this is really going to be based on what happened in the session, right? Like, if there's something it seemed their character was interested in, asking them, like, hey, do you want to follow up more on this in a later session? Or hey, I noticed this thing. Like, if there's anything you notice, for example, that they built their character as a melee character, but they kept using ranged attacks, and they thought ranged attacks were fun, suggesting that, they might rebuild towards something that was more in their interest.
What if their character build seemed to be okay, but they seem to be maybe a bit lost by, like, the overall story arc and what's going on in the campaign?
I would say giving them a summary, giving them a campaign summary. If you didn't have a chance up front to do that, it's good to give people a summary up front of the major beats. Giving them a campaign summary,
What if it's actually pretty early in the campaign, but they still seem to be lost about, like, even that session that they were in, exactly all the things that were going on, just because they were dealing with the new rules,
Yeah.
And so they've forgotten.
Well, I would say
and
that
didn't seem to take in all of the story.
I would say that while session recaps generally traditionally are thought of as something that begins a session, there's no harm in doing a session asking the players to pull together a recap of what happened during that session, so that they can make sure that they're hitting the major beats.
Mm-hmm. And anything in between first and second session that you would do after
definitely.
that debrief?
I would check in with them on. I would check in with them and how they enjoyed the session, and if there's anything they want to change with their character, based on what they saw, based on what you saw, or just in general. So
similar to the debrief at the end of the session, but you might check in between sessions if you didn't get the debrief, or in addition.
Or in addition to, well, I would say that like at the end of a session, you're honestly probably not going to have a huge amount of time to talk to them, and they're not going to have time to process everything. So giving them like emailing them or having some other way. They might not even
know fully how they feel until
or
they
things like that.
It.
So giving them a way to contact you, emailing them, checking in with them on stuff like that if you have a way to do that. And then like if you have a chance to talk to them, for example, if you're in a situation where it's like you don't want to email them, you don't feel comfortable with that because you don't really know them or things like that, checking in with them before the start of the second session, like if it's Mumbat was saying here, if it's in a public venue as opposed to someone you're bringing in to a home group, that can be a way to check in about things and see how they're going.
Mm-hmm. So what about second session and beyond of actually playing?
Mm-hmm.
So at that point, they're not a brand new player. They have a session under their belt. They play with your group. You've done all these things.
I would say that it's a matter of gradually phasing out support structures until you get to the point where you are at with your normal group. But that doesn't mean that these kinds of tactics and tricks that are used for new players are things that you can't use in your home group. That I personally, and Mark as well, my GM style is fairly similar to his. I mean, I learned to GM from him, and I really like that sort of style. We both allow some degree. We both allow some degree of retconning on turns. If people were like distracted or confused, or it seems like they didn't notice everything that was going on. We both, if a player seems out of it, we both provide more guidance for them for who they might be able to attack. Like somebody got a call or they're really tired that day and they're not really sure what's going on in the battlefield, then we can provide them. It's like, okay, do you want to attack the beefy one in the front or the injured one over on the side? Yep.
And with the retconning, like our group as a whole is for it, but we have a sense of when it's like not fair play.
Yeah.
Like in our most recent session of Iron Fang, there was a situation that was pretty deadly and may have actually resulted in a death because I didn't cast Fly on the monk to get the monk up, because I didn't realize that the enemy was actually 15 feet in the air. But the thing that I actually did do, which is completely whiff a mind thrust spell, even despite at level 11 getting a 26 on my spell, my check against SR, seemed like it, which is a high roll, but it seems like it gave us too much information. Like, it has SR, its SR is really high, and I failed the check. So we all concluded that it would not be fair for me to.
Whereas I would allow a new player in that circumstance I would probably allow it just to like let that slide and let them retcon to change things around.
But in this situation, it was literally the GM did not tell us that the monster was 15 feet up, and there was no way to tell that it was.
Yeah.
But we all agreed, including me. I immediately said, I don't think it's fair for me to take it back, but we may be in trouble if we can't get the monk up there. But I learned a lot of information by that failed mind thrust, and it's too late.
I want to talk about here a recommendation from Katsude Warlock. Assembling new player starter kits using helpful tools from PFS Shared Prep and other sites, blank character sheets, etc. is really helpful. Yes, exactly. Having those kinds of starter materials is super useful, and an organized play in particular, the volunteer community has done such great work with generating those, and I highly recommend checking those out.
Yep. So yeah, eventually, like you were saying, your new player transitions into being a player. I mean, just any of your other players, and how that journey works is different for every person.
And I would say also also, like, so I, for example, was one of those players who was pretty far on the end of not wanting to be told what I would do with my turns. So for me, like, the fact that I missed crucial factors of what my character could do on each of my first 3 sessions was something that I laughed about afterwards. It was like, oh, ha, I missed it. Whereas I would have gotten ticked off if you, like, told me, like, oh, you forgot that you needed to use this thing.
Like, in my setting, there, that we were playing in, there were lycanthropes who, were actually generally a little more benevolent than usual and worshiped the chaotic, neutral, sort of goodish, goddess of, freedom. A lot of them did, and of the moon. But there were these dark lycanthropes that are, like, that are evil opposites of lycanthropes, like fiends and celestials in that setting, and worship the goddess of darkness, who is the enemy of the goddess of the moon. And Linda's character had a prestige class when she first started, level 5 cleric, level 2 in the prestige class of the moon goddess, that gave her an ability that allows her to rebuke dark lycanthropes, which is not even very useful. It was just like sort of a ribbon-free ability that it got. But just because we were introducing her character, so the party got attacked by dark lycanthropes, and she did not rebuke the dark lycanthropes.
How the heck did you figure out that I didn't want you to tell me? Like, I know we talked a fair amount before that, but we'd only known each other for like a week or 2 at that point. Like, how the heck did you figure it out?
I wasn't sure if you would have wanted to know or not exactly. I kind of mentioned, like, these are dark lycanthropes, the enemies of Silene. And then you were role-playing, like, how much you didn't like them.
Yeah.
And then you also had the freedom domain, or whichever the domain is that makes it so that you get a free freedom of movement against certain effects.
Yeah.
And you got grappled by those effects and could have activated rounds of that ability and did not do it.
And then there was some other healing ability I had in the 3rd session that I didn't remember that I had.
That's right.
But I guess that just goes to show, like, if I had been following my own advice, I would have annoyed myself. Because I'm weird.
You are a little bit weird, Linda.
So, you know, you're going to, nobody's going to get it perfect.
Yep. Just turned out to be fine, and like the party could handle the lycanthropes. And
now, if I had been following if those encounters had been too hard, and I later figured out that the party like had some terrible consequence that came because I didn't remember, then that would have been a problem for me.
Don't worry, I didn't make your level 7 party fight one level 6 flying archer.
No, level 6 flying archers. Those still would have killed us at level 14, as we've discussed on the show.
Alright, so I think we
would have had to plane shift or do something ridiculous.
It was, you could have escaped the level 6 flying archer at level 14, but you could not have beaten them.
Correct.
Assuming they were maximally intelligent and always stayed outside of medium range of spells, which they could have done. Because your group did not have a way to ensure closing into medium range.
I would also say that when we talk about these things, watching how the players at your table are interacting with a new player, making sure they're not taking their turns for them, and making sure that they're giving them space to speak, is very important.
Yep. All right. So I think that about covers onboarding new players from start to finish, as we've said the whole time. It varies from player to player. You need to read the player, and that's very important. But these tips will help you establish a baseline that you can sort of move on and off of fluidly based on what the player wants. Does anyone in chat have any other questions about new player onboarding? If not, then we can say farewell to YouTube.
Bye, YouTube!
Bye! See you next time!